In January of 1945, while American soldiers were freezing in the Ardennes, a file landed on a desk far behind the line. Not a tank report, not an artillery map, not a casualty list, a promotion file. Inside it was everything the Army claimed it needed: combat experience, frontline recommendations, tactical competence, a record that said plainly this man could lead. Then one word killed it: temperament. That was the word. Not cowardice, not failure, not lack of skill. Temperament. And in that single, vague word, the United States Army hid one of the most dangerous truths of the Second World War. Because while German artillery was tearing open the American line at the Battle of the Bulge, another fight was happening inside the American Army itself. A fight over who was allowed to lead, who was allowed to be trusted, who could wear an officer's bar, and who could be sent into battle, prove himself under fire, and still be told that the problem was something no metal could fix. The enemy in front of the line was wearing field gray. The enemy behind the desk was wearing American uniform. To understand why that file mattered, you have to go back to the morning the Ardennes exploded. December 16, 1944. At 5:30 in the morning, German guns opened across the frozen forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. Snow lay in the ditches. Fog pressed low between the pines. The weather was so bad that Allied aircraft could not see the roads beneath them. And that was exactly what the Germans needed. Hundreds of thousands of men came out of the forest. Tanks rolled through narrow roads. Artillery hammered thin American lines that had been placed there because the sector was supposed to be quiet. It was not quiet anymore. Some American units were hit before they understood they were in the middle of a full offensive. Radio lines collapsed. Road junctions became death traps. Whole companies were cut off in the snow with no clear idea of what was happening on either side of them. This was the Battle of the Bulge. By the time the fighting ended in late January 1945, the United States had suffered more than 80,000 casualties. More than 19,000 Americans had been killed. It was the bloodiest battle the United States fought in the Second World War. And that is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Because in the same army, losing officers and NCOs in the snow, in the same army begging for replacements, in the same army trying to hold roads and towns with men who had not slept in days, qualified black soldiers were still being blocked from leadership, not because the army lacked evidence, because the army refused to read its own evidence honestly. The United States did not enter World War II as a clean instrument of democracy. It entered the war carrying Jim Crow inside its uniforms. Segregation was not an accident in the Army. It was structure. It was policy. It was paperwork, housing, transport, mess halls, training camps, promotion boards, and medical procedures. Black soldiers and white soldiers did not simply serve in different units. They moved through different systems. They trained separately. They ate separately. They were often assigned separately. Even donated blood was separated by race, as if plasma could understand skin. More than 1 million black Americans served in uniform during the Second World War. But in 1941, the entire United States Army had only 5 black commissioned officers. 5. And 3 of them were chaplains. That number tells you almost everything about the institution. The Army did not merely doubt black leadership. It had built a machine to prevent it. Official thinking from the period described black soldiers as unfit for certain kinds of command, lacking the temperament, character, or moral qualities required for combat leadership. Those words mattered because they did not stay in reports. They traveled. They traveled into training assignments. They traveled into officer candidate boards. They traveled into the tone of white officers sent to command black units. They traveled into the quiet confidence of clerks who believed they were not discriminating, only preserving order. And once a belief becomes administrative procedure, it no longer has to shout. It only has to stamp. Temperament. That was the perfect bureaucratic weapon. It sounded professional. It sounded measured. It sounded like judgment. But it did not have to prove anything. A man could pass the exam. A man could earn battlefield recommendations. A man could lead other men through fire. A man could be exactly the kind of soldier a dying army needed. And still the board could write temperament. No definition. No evidence. No appeal that could pierce the fog. The word was soft enough to hide the prejudice and hard enough to close the door. That was the army black soldiers faced before they ever faced the Germans. They were asked to fight for a country that would not yet trust them with the meaning of their own courage. And still, they fought. Across France in 1944, the Red Ball Express kept Allied armies moving. Its trucks carried fuel, ammunition, food, and everything else a mechanized army consumed faster than any planner expected. Many of those drivers were black soldiers. They drove through darkness with headlights covered. They pushed overloaded trucks down roads chewed apart by war. They slept little, repaired what broke, and kept moving because Patton's Third Army could not advance on speeches. It needed gasoline. The 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, proved the same point in steel. They entered combat in late 1944 and fought for 183 consecutive days. They drove into towns, crossed shattered roads, helped punch through German defenses, and fought through the same winter that broke lesser assumptions. Their record became impossible to explain away. But institutions do not surrender a lie the first time reality contradicts it. They wait. They qualify. They blame training. They blame morale. They blame leadership. They blame anything except the premise. That was the trap. Black soldiers were denied leadership because the army said they lacked experience. Then they were denied the chance to gain the kind of experience the army claimed to require. And when some of them gained it anyway, their files still met the same word: temperament. Then the Ardennes emergency made the contradiction visible. The Battle of the Bulge created a manpower crisis the army could not hide behind theory. Rifle companies were being chewed down in the snow. Replacement depots could not keep pace with the losses. Commanders needed men who would move, hold, carry, fire, lead, and survive. So the army did something it had resisted for years. It allowed black soldiers from service units to volunteer for infantry combat. Thousands volunteered. Men who had been driving trucks, loading supplies, handling graves registration, cooking meals, repairing engines, and doing the labor that kept the army alive stepped forward to carry rifles. They were not forced into it by shortage alone. They volunteered. They knew what the infantry was suffering. They knew what the Ardennes was doing to men. They knew that a rifle platoon in that weather was not a symbol. It was a wound with boots on, and still they volunteered. That mattered, because the army had spent years saying black soldiers were not suited for combat leadership. Then, in the worst infantry crisis in the European War, black soldiers stepped toward the line. The evidence did not whisper anymore. It shouted. But inside the promotion machinery, the old wall still stood. A black non-commissioned officer could come out of the line with proof all over him, and still the board could decide that proof was not the point. He could have the respect of men who had seen him under fire. He could have a company commander willing to put his own name behind the recommendation. He could have exactly the sort of calm judgment that combat separates from parade ground polish, and still a rear office could say no. Not because the man failed, because the system needed him to fail. That is the part that makes the story darker than one act of discrimination. It was not merely personal hatred. It was habit. It was comfort. It was a hierarchy defending itself under the language of standards. The men behind those desks did not have to think of themselves as villains. That made them more dangerous. They could sit in heated rooms, with clean hands and polished floors, and turn battlefield leadership into a paper problem. They could protect the officer corps from men who had already proven they could lead soldiers better than many of the officers wearing bars. And after the stamp came down, they could go to dinner. That is the world George Patton walked into. And Patton is not the simple hero some versions of this story want him to be. He was brilliant, vain, theatrical, ruthless, and deeply shaped by the prejudices of his time. He was not a modern civil rights reformer dropped into a tank commander's uniform. He held views that deserve no softening. But Patton believed in war with a cold and practical religion. War punished waste. War punished delay. War punished officers who confused comfort with judgment. And by the winter of 1944, Patton had very little patience left for any system that kept useful fighting men out of useful fighting positions. He had just performed one of the most famous operational maneuvers of the war. When the Germans broke through the Ardennes, Patton's Third Army was facing east. Within days, he pivoted it north through winter weather to drive toward Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne was surrounded. That turn did not happen because Patton was lucky. It happened because he had been watching the map, thinking ahead, and demanding readiness before the emergency arrived. That was his method. Move before the room is comfortable. Decide before the perfect memo exists. Go where the problem is. Make the system move at the speed of the battlefield. So when reports reached him that qualified black soldiers were being denied commissions under vague language, Patton did not see only a moral failure. He saw operational stupidity. In a war consuming leaders, the army was throwing away leadership. In a campaign where a platoon could live or die by the judgment of one man, the system was telling proven soldiers that their skin mattered more than their record. To Patton, that was not merely prejudice, it was sabotage by paperwork. The surviving record does not give us a perfect movie scene. History rarely does. There is no clean transcript of every word spoken in every rear office, no camera in the room, no dramatic courtroom ending where the guilty confess and the righteous walk out. What the record does show is the pattern around the event. Black soldiers with real qualifications were blocked. Frontline officers objected. The issue reached higher command. The pressure changed. And the wall that had been holding those commissions began to crack. Accounts of Patton's command style make the response easy to understand. He did not love slow paperwork. He did not hide from confrontation. He did not like staff officers who turned war into a private language no soldier could survive. He went directly at problems, and the problem here had a name. The board was using a standard it could not define to deny men whose qualifications it could not honestly erase. Temperament. Imagine the file again, not as a symbol, as a physical object. Paper pages, typed lines, a name, a service number, a recommendation, a combat note. Maybe a company commander's signature written by a man who knew what the candidate had done when shells were falling. Then the rejection. One word trying to outweigh all of it. That is what makes the file so powerful. It shows how racism survives when it wants to look respectable. It does not always need a shouted slur. It does not always need a violent mob. Sometimes it wears a uniform, sits at a desk, and turns prejudice into personnel language. But once a commander with enough authority says, "Show me the standard," the disguise begins to fail. Because if the standard is performance, the files speak. If the standard is leadership, the battlefield speaks. If the standard is courage, the men who followed them speak. And if the standard is race, then the institution has to admit what it has been doing. That was the danger of Patton's intervention. Not that one board was embarrassed, that the Army was forced, however briefly and imperfectly, to compare its stated standard with its actual behavior. And those two things did not match. The resistance came exactly where you would expect, from people who called discrimination discipline, from officers who called hierarchy tradition, from administrators who said the problem was not the qualified black officer, but what white soldiers might do if ordered to salute him. That argument had a name: unit cohesion. It sounded serious. It sounded military. It sounded like the kind of phrase men use when they want fear to appear wise. The claim was simple. Even if black soldiers were qualified, white soldiers might not obey them. And if white soldiers did not obey them, order would break. Therefore, to protect order, the Army should keep qualified black soldiers from command. Look closely at what that argument does. It takes the prejudice of the insubordinate man and treats it as law. It says the Army should bend around bigotry instead of commanding it. It says a soldier's refusal to obey a qualified officer is not the soldier's failure, but the system's warning. Patton's answer, in spirit, was brutal because it was military. If a soldier refuses a lawful order because of the race of the officer giving it, the problem is not cohesion. The problem is insubordination. And armies do not negotiate with insubordination. They punish it. That was the difference. The bureaucrats treated prejudice as the fixed point. Patton treated the standard as the fixed point. One position protects comfort, the other runs an army. Meanwhile, black soldiers continued doing the thing no committee could dismiss. They fought. The black infantry volunteers attached to white units during the Bulge performed well enough that the old claims grew harder to maintain. The predictions of collapse did not become the battlefield reality the skeptics had warned about. Men learned what combat always teaches faster than doctrine admits. When fire comes in, a soldier's question is not about the skin color of the man giving the order. It is whether he knows the ground, whether he sees the flank, whether he understands when to move and when to get down, whether his order will get men killed for nothing or get them home. Combat does not make racism disappear, but it exposes false standards with terrible speed. A useless officer is dangerous no matter what he looks like. A competent leader is valuable no matter what the board once called him. That was the lesson the Army kept receiving and resisting at the same time. The 761st kept proving it in tanks. The Red Ball Express kept proving it on roads. The infantry volunteers kept proving it in snow. The denied NCOs kept proving it in files their commanders refused to let die. Each proof point cut into the old lie, not with slogans, with results. And results are difficult for a military institution to ignore forever. By 1945, the Army was carrying two truths that could not live together. The official truth said segregation was necessary for efficiency, morale, and order. The battlefield truth said the Army had wasted talent, wasted courage, and weakened itself by refusing to promote men on merit. The official truth said black soldiers were temperamentally unsuited for leadership. The battlefield truth showed black men leading under conditions that broke carefully trained white officers. The official truth said white troops would not accept black authority. The battlefield truth showed that under fire, competence had its own authority. That contradiction did not end segregation overnight. Nothing that large dies politely. But it became evidence. And evidence matters when a nation is trying to tell itself a story about why it fought. In the United States, black newspapers had already been pressing the WWII campaign, victory against fascism abroad, and victory against racism at home. Black soldiers returning from Europe carried more than memories. They carried proof of what they had done for a country that still denied them basic dignity. They had driven the supply roads. They had crewed the tanks. They had volunteered for infantry. They had buried the dead. They had crossed into Germany. They had seen officers trust them in 1 hour and institutions deny them in the next. That kind of contradiction does not stay buried. It comes home. It walks into veteran offices. It enters churches and union halls. It appears in newspapers. It hardens into a demand that the nation obey its own language. On July 26, 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981. The order declared equality of treatment and opportunity in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. That signature did not magically fix the military. The old habits survived. Some services resisted. Implementation took years. The last all-black Army unit was not inactivated until the 1950s. But the legal foundation had shifted, and the shift was not built by one man. Not by Truman alone. Not by Patton alone. Not by a single promotion board. Not by one heroic file. It was built by accumulated proof. By thousands of black soldiers forcing the record to tell the truth. By men who were told they were support troops, then kept the army alive. By men who were told they could not fight, then volunteered into the Bulge. By men who were told they could not lead, then gave orders under fire. By men who were told they lacked temperament, then showed more discipline than the institution judging them. That is why this story matters. Not because Patton was pure. He was not. Not because the army suddenly discovered justice. It did not. This story matters because it shows one of the ways institutions change. Sometimes the moral argument is clear long before the institution accepts it. Sometimes the human cost is obvious long before the policy changes. And sometimes the wall does not crack because the people guarding it become better. It cracks because reality makes the wall too expensive to maintain. Patton's role sits in that uncomfortable place. He was no clean saint. He was no uncomplicated liberator. But in that winter, facing a battlefield that punished every wasted advantage, he looked at a system that was throwing away capable leaders and treated it as a command problem. He did not need to become a different man to expose the contradiction. He only had to follow the evidence farther than the institution wanted him to. That is both inspiring and disturbing. Inspiring because even imperfect pressure can break a correct procedure. Disturbing because it should never have required a general's anger for qualified men to receive what they had already earned. Think of the black sergeant again. The man whose file carried proof on one side and rejection on the other. He was not asking the army for a favor. He was asking it to believe its own battlefield. He was asking it to measure leadership by leadership, courage by courage, competence by competence. And when enough men forced that standard into the open, the old word began to lose its power. Temperament had been used to hide a lie. The battlefield answered with evidence. George Patton died in December 1945 after a car accident in occupied Germany. He was buried in Luxembourg, near many of the soldiers his Third Army had commanded through the war. His legacy remains difficult, as it should. But in the winter of 1944 and 1945, inside an army fighting two wars at once, he helped force a question the institution could not escape. If a man can fight, lead, endure, and bring others through fire, what right does a desk have to call him unfit? The German line could be seen on the map. The other line was drawn through the army itself. And the men who crossed it did not just help win a battle. They helped make the old excuse impossible to defend.